Most people do not suffer because life is cruel. They suffer because they do not see what is moving them. We believe we are choosing. We believe we are deciding. We believe we are steering the direction of our own existence. Yet beneath every decision, something older, deeper, and more relentless is already at work. Before modern psychology gave it language, before self-help culture tried to tame it, thinkers like Schopenhauer had already revealed a disturbing insight. What we call the self is not master of the house. It is a guest. And if that is true, then a sharper question emerges. Are you living your life, or is something living through you? Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Now we return to the harder ground. Long before the noise of 2025, before algorithms learned our desires faster than we could name them, philosophy had already confronted the architecture of human restlessness. Kant drew a line between the world as it appears and the world as it is. Schopenhauer stripped that world down further and called its engine will. Not hope, not reason, will. This is not abstract theory. It is diagnosis. What you are about to explore is not comfort. It is exposure. We will move from the surface of everyday ambition into the hidden mechanics of desire, identity, love, suffering, and death. Step by step, we will confront the structure beneath the mask. And at the end of that descent, one question will remain unavoidable. If the self is not what you thought it was, then who exactly are you? The world, as we see it, is never the world as it is. This is the first fracture in our confidence, the first crack that reveals how fragile our certainty has always been. We believe we perceive reality directly, yet what reaches us is only the filtered echo of something far more complex, far more indifferent, far more silent. And when the mind finally confronts this truth, it is forced to answer a question it has long avoided. What do we actually know if every experience is shaped before we can even grasp it? Long before the age when people celebrated data and worshiped clarity, one thinker had already stripped the illusion bare. He insisted that the world appearing before us is not the world itself, but a phenomenon arranged inside the architecture of our own consciousness. Space is not out there. Time is not out there. Causality is not out there. They are forms of perception, scaffolding erected by the human mind so that chaos becomes interpretable. The world is not delivered to us. The world is constructed within us. This is not a gentle claim. It is a confrontation. If every experience is organized by the mind before being recognized, then reality is not something we witness, but something we generate. What we call objective truth becomes a negotiation between the raw unknown and the interpretive machinery inside our skull. The senses provide the stimulus, the mind provides the world. And this means the distance between appearance and essence is not small, it is infinite. The first argument emerges here with full force. The mind does not receive the world, it shapes it, it frames it, it forces it into categories that fit its structure. Experience is never pure. It is processed, translated, filtered. The essence of things remains hidden behind layers of interpretation. Yet modern individuals cling to the myth of transparency, believing that seeing is understanding. But vision only reveals forms already molded by the mind. The world we inhabit is therefore not reality, interpretation, and the conclusion is sharp. To know ourselves is to know the machinery that distorts the world before we even encounter it. The second argument rises like a shadow. Human beings mistake stability for truth. We assume the continuity of time because the mind orders events sequentially. We assume the separation of objects because the mind divides space into units. We assume cause and effect because the mind cannot conceive chaos without imposing order onto it. These structures feel natural, self-evident, undeniable, yet they are neither universal nor inherent in the world. They are conditions of our experience. Without them, consciousness would collapse. With them, consciousness mistakes its own structure for the structure of reality. The misunderstanding is inevitable, but it is also dangerous, and the philosophical lesson cuts deeply. We live inside the limits of our perception, but we speak as if we possess the truth of the universe. The third argument exposes the most stubborn illusion. Humans believe they know what they encounter. They believe their judgments reflect the world rather than their own biases. But every perception is already an interpretation. Every interpretation is shaped by memory, expectation, fear, desire. The mind does not show us reality. It shows us what we are prepared to see. And this means our life is not determined by the world, but by the way we read it. Most suffering, most confusion, most conflict arise not from things themselves, but from the meanings we force upon them. And the conclusion is uncompromising. To change the way we live, we must confront the way we interpret, not the world, but ourselves. When this ancient insight is carried into the age of 2025, it becomes even sharper. Modern individuals believe technological sophistication grants them clearer access to reality. But clarity is not increased. Illusion is refined. Speed magnifies distortion. Information becomes noise, disguised as knowledge. The problem is not that the world is complex, but that our interpretations multiply faster than our ability to examine them. We call it awareness, but it is saturation. We call it progress, but it is camouflage. Modernity does not dissolve illusion, it industrializes it. That is why the distance between appearance and reality feels more violent today. Not because the world has changed, but because the mind is drowning in its own projections. Algorithms reinforce our biases. Images override reflection. Attention fragments. And the same ancient error persists. We mistake what we see for what is. We mistake certainty for truth. We mistake comfort for understanding. And thus the contemporary human faces the same philosophical confrontation. We are not living in the world. We are living in our reading of the world. And that reading is unstable, insecure, perpetually threatened by contradiction. At this point, the psychological depth opens. Beneath the structure of perception lies something more primitive: fear. The fear that without interpretation, the world collapses into meaninglessness. The fear that without causality, events become unbearable. The fear that without identity, experience dissolves. Humans cling to their interpretations not because they are true, but because they are necessary. Interpretation protects us from the abyss of not knowing. It shields us from the formlessness of reality. But this protection has a cost. It imprisons us inside the very structures we created. We desire freedom, but refuse to loosen the mental frameworks that ensure our captivity. This is the existential contradiction. We long for truth, yet depend on illusion. We seek certainty, yet are built upon boundaries that distort. We demand clarity, but fear the dismantling of the categories that give our world coherence. And so, the human mind oscillates between two poles: the craving for understanding and the terror of losing its familiar interpretations. This tension defines our consciousness. It shapes our suffering. It marks the core of our humanity. To illuminate this dilemma, imagine a single symbolic figure, a thinker, seated before a window, observing the outside world with attentiveness that seems almost severe. The scene is simple, but its meaning is not. The thinker believes he is watching the world, yet what he truly observes is the operation of his own mind. Every tree is perceived through memory, every color through expectation, every movement through causality. What he sees is not the world, but the phenomenon organized within him. Through this figure, the argument becomes vivid. Humans believe they encounter reality, yet they never escape the boundary of their own cognition. This symbolic figure reveals something essential. To perceive is to interpret. To interpret is to distort. And distortion is not a flaw, but a condition of consciousness itself. The world does not adjust to our categories. We impose our categories on the world. And this is where the philosophical weight settles. If our experience is always shaped, then the question is not whether our interpretation is accurate, but whether we are aware that we are interpreting at all. Ignorance of this fact is the root of confusion. Awareness of it is the beginning of liberation. When all these strands converge, a single truth emerges. Human life unfolds within two worlds: the world as it appears to us, and the world that exists beyond our perception. We inhabit the first and speculate about the second. The boundary between them cannot be crossed, only acknowledged. Yet this acknowledgement carries transformative power. It reveals the limits of certainty. It exposes the illusions we mistake for reality. It forces us to confront the responsibility of interpretation. And it teaches us that the search for truth is not a journey outward, but inward, into the mechanisms that shape every fragment of our awareness. And so the inquiry does not close here. Once we recognize that appearance is not essence, another question rises with unavoidable urgency, demanding to be faced. If the world that reaches us is always filtered and shaped, then what is the force that drives us to interpret at all? The force behind the restlessness, the longing, the constant movement of the human mind toward desire, toward action, toward becoming. The mind bends reality, but what bends the mind? The mind bends reality, but what bends the mind? This question tears open the surface we thought we understood. It forces us to confront the hidden engine beneath every desire, every decision, every restless movement of our existence. There is a force that does not ask permission, does not explain itself, does not rest. It presses from within, shaping the contours of our actions long before consciousness arrives to justify them. And the unsettling truth is this: we are not the architects of our longing. We are the instruments of something deeper. Long before modern psychology described impulses and the unconscious, one philosopher had already stripped the human condition to its raw mechanism. He declared that beneath thought, beneath reason, beneath the fragile narratives we construct about ourselves, there is a primal will, a blind striving that surges through every living form. This will is not chosen. It is not rational. It does not negotiate. It simply drives. It demands movement, expansion, continuation. It is the silent architect of our hungers. And no matter how refined our intellect becomes, it remains at the mercy of this restless, invisible force. The first confrontation is stark. What we call desire is not a personal preference. It is the surface ripple of a deeper current. The will pushes us to seek, to reach, to want. It whispers through instinct, through intuition, through the sudden surge of longing that seems to appear out of nowhere. We believe these impulses belong to us, but they precede us. They shape us. They inhabit us like an ancient rhythm that the intellect merely follows. The misunderstanding is common. We assume our choices express freedom, but most choices express the will's strategy. And the conclusion is unavoidable. To understand ourselves, we must first recognize the force that moves us before thought even awakens. The second argument strikes at the core of human restlessness. The will does not seek satisfaction. It seeks repetition. Its movement is cyclical, not conclusive. Every fulfilled desire is immediately replaced by a new one, not because we are flawed, but because the will cannot tolerate stillness. It demands continuity. It pushes us toward goals only to abandon them the moment they are reached. Happiness becomes a temporary anesthetic, a brief pause in the relentless machinery of striving. Yet people misinterpret this pattern, blaming themselves for the inability to remain content. They call it personal failure. But it is not failure. It is structure. It is the architecture of existence itself. And the conclusion is severe. Our suffering is not an accident. It is woven into the way life perpetuates itself. The third argument reveals the hidden depth of this force. The will operates mostly in darkness. It lives beneath consciousness, generating impulses long before the mind interprets them. Modern psychology echoes this insight, describing how motivations arise from layers we rarely access. But the will goes deeper still. It is not merely psychological, it is metaphysical. It is the engine of being. And because it is blind, it does not aim at happiness or meaning. It aims only at continuation. This is why individuals often feel driven without understanding why. This is why desire feels both personal and alien. This is why even when we achieve everything we believed we wanted, an unease remains, a tremor, an emptiness that signals another demand rising from the depths. And the philosophical verdict is stark. The will does not serve our well-being. We serve its persistence. When this insight enters the world of 2025, it becomes sharper, almost merciless. People speak of ambition, passion, discipline, as if these are conscious projects. But beneath the polished language lies the same ancient machinery. The will adapts to modern forms, disguising itself as productivity, self-improvement, constant optimization. What appears as progress is often compulsion. What appears as freedom is often obedience to an inner force we do not control. Modern culture celebrates the relentless pursuit of goals, but this celebration is simply the will wearing contemporary clothes. The structure has not changed, only its vocabulary has. And the modern individual, drowning in tasks and aspirations, mistakes exhaustion for purpose. This is why rest feels impossible, why silence becomes frightening, why emptiness must be filled immediately with stimulation, distraction, or new desire. The will cannot endure stillness because stillness exposes its nature. Without motion, its illusion of direction collapses. And so modern humans live in a state of continuous acceleration, unable to distinguish between authentic will and inherited compulsion. The world does not demand this pace. The will does. And the terrifying realization follows. We are not merely pressured by society. We are pressured by the architecture of our own existence. At this point, the existential psychology deepens. Beneath desire lies fear. The fear of stagnation. The fear of insignificance. The fear that without constant striving, we will confront the void within ourselves. This void is not a flaw. It is the silence beneath the will. But the will cannot allow us to remain there. It thrusts us forward with cravings that feel urgent, necessary, absolute. Yet these cravings are often masks. We chase accomplishments not because they fulfill us, but because they keep the void at a safe distance. We pursue relationships not only for intimacy, but to avoid confronting our internal fragmentation. We accumulate experiences not to grow, but to distract ourselves from the unshakable truth that the will is never satisfied. Humans rarely admit this. They tell stories about their desires to make them appear coherent, meaningful, intentional. But the body knows. The restless pulse, the tension before achievement, the collapse afterward. The cycle repeats. The will does not rest. It only resets. And this produces a fundamental anxiety. We sense that something inside us demands without caring for our well-being. We sense that our suffering is not accidental, but structural. And this awareness unsettles the deepest layers of consciousness. It confronts us with the possibility that freedom is far more limited than we assume. To illuminate this, imagine a figure standing at the threshold of a vast plain, driven forward by an invisible wind. The plain stretches endlessly, and the wind never stops. The figure believes he chooses to walk, believes he moves out of intention, but the wind behind him is constant, relentless, impersonal. He can pause, but the pressure remains. He can resist, but exhaustion follows. He moves not because he wants to, but because something deeper than wanting pushes him forward. This scene captures the essence of the will. It pushes all living beings in a direction they do not choose, toward goals they believe are theirs, through struggles that feel personal but are universal. Through this image, the truth becomes stark. The will does not negotiate. It does not respond to moral reasoning. It does not care for meaning, happiness, or clarity. It cares only for continuation. And because humans are conscious, we suffer its force more intensely than any other creature. We feel the demands. We imagine alternatives. We question the purpose. Yet questioning does not free us. It merely exposes the gap between the will's blind striving and our longing for understanding. When these threads converge, a single recognition emerges with sharp inevitability. The foundation of human life is not rationality, autonomy, or purpose, but a ceaseless impulse that precedes all thought. We are shaped by it, driven by it, exhausted by it. And yet, because we can reflect, we are also capable of seeing its operation. This sight does not liberate us from the will, but it reveals the structure of our suffering. It shows that restlessness is not a defect, but a condition. It shows that our deepest struggles are not failures, but consequences of being alive. And it reveals that meaning cannot be found by satisfying desire, because desire has no endpoint. Meaning must be found elsewhere, in a realm untouched by the will's hunger. And this leads us to the next inevitable confrontation. If the will drives us endlessly, why does satisfaction always dissolve the moment we grasp it? Why does every fulfillment collapse into boredom, into new longing, into the same cycle repeating itself with different objects and different stories? What is the nature of this perpetual emptiness that follows achievement? And why does it seem woven into the human condition itself? Why does every fulfillment collapse into boredom, into new longing, into the same cycle repeating itself with different objects and different stories? The answer is not hidden in the world, but in the structure of the human mind itself. What we call dissatisfaction is not an error in our desires, but the very mechanism that sustains them. The moment we touch what we wanted, the wanting dissolves, and with it dissolves the intensity that once animated us. Satisfaction is the death of desire. And because desire is the force that propels our existence, the mind refuses to remain in that stillness. It manufactures absence the moment presence is achieved. The first confrontation is brutal. Human beings do not suffer because they fail to achieve their goals. They suffer because goals cannot provide what they promise. Desire pushes us toward an imagined completion, a moment when the self will finally feel whole, stable, unmistakably right. But the moment arrives and it breaks. The feeling slips. The mind, unable to sustain the illusion of finality, begins preparing the next pursuit before the joy of the previous one has even faded. We believe this restlessness is circumstantial, that we simply have not found the right object, the right partner, the right accomplishment. But this is a misunderstanding. The failure is not in the objects. The failure is in the assumption that desire can reach an endpoint. The second confrontation exposes the architecture of this illusion. Desire thrives on distance, on the imagined gap between what we have and what we want. It intensifies as long as the object remains unattained. The moment the distance collapses, the desire collapses with it. This is why anticipation feels richer than possession, why longing feels more alive than satisfaction, why the dream of a future often holds more emotional depth than the reality itself. And yet, people misinterpret this dynamic. They believe the solution is to find better goals, purer desires, more meaningful projects. They assume the dissatisfaction is a sign of misalignment. But this is false. Dissatisfaction is built into the very process of desiring. It is the furnace in which desire burns. The third confrontation forces us deeper. If dissatisfaction is inherent, then what exactly do we seek when we chase desire? It is not the object. It is not the achievement. It is not the experience. What we pursue is the temporary annihilation of the gap itself. We refuse the emptiness at the center of the self, and desire becomes our method of escape. We do not want the thing, we want the disappearance of wanting. But since the disappearance is momentary, the escape is incomplete. The emptiness returns, the will reignites, a new desire emerges, the cycle repeats, and the conclusion is stark. Human beings do not seek fulfillment. They seek relief from the ache of incompleteness. But the relief is fleeting by design. When this insight is carried into the modern world of 2025, its force becomes almost overwhelming. Society has perfected the machinery of desire, multiplying objects at a pace faster than human consciousness can process. The market thrives on dissatisfaction, feeding the will with endless stimuli, ensuring that the cycle continues without pause. People do not merely want, they are conditioned to want more quickly, more intensely, more frequently. What was once a natural rhythm has become an accelerated loop. The dissatisfaction that once unfolded slowly now erupts in rapid succession. The calm space between desires, once considered part of the human condition, is now nearly extinct. This acceleration has consequences. The modern individual is swept into a state of perpetual hunger, unable to distinguish genuine longing from manufactured craving. Rest becomes guilt. Stillness becomes irritation. Silence becomes threat. The mind is trained to chase, not to question the chase. It becomes easier to pursue than to pause, easier to acquire than to understand the architecture of wanting. And so dissatisfaction grows, not because desires fail, but because the speed of new desires erodes the fragile moment of fulfillment before it can even be recognized. At the psychological level, the roots of this dynamic deepen. Dissatisfaction is not simply the absence of fulfillment. It is the expression of an internal tension that predates conscious desire. There is a void inside the self, a fundamental sense of incompleteness that no achievement can touch. This void is not pathological, it is existential. It is part of being a conscious creature, aware of its own fragmentation. The will exploits this void, generating desires to fill it. But the void cannot be filled by things that belong to the world, because the void does not originate in the world. It originates in the structure of the self. This truth is difficult to face. Humans are taught that dissatisfaction is a flaw in personal effort or circumstance. They believe that happiness lies just beyond the next achievement, the next relationship, the next transformation. But the void remains untouched because it is not healed by external objects. It is merely distracted. And the distraction, while powerful, is temporary. This is why the moment after achievement feels strangely hollow, why joy fades faster than expected, why the sense of incompleteness returns with uncanny precision. The void was never addressed. It was only paused. To clarify this condition, imagine a person standing before a well. The well is deep, dark, silent. The person drops into it objects that symbolize desires, accomplishments, possessions, victories, recognitions. The objects fall, but the well never fills. The silence remains. The depth remains. The person continues throwing, believing the next object might create a sound that signifies completion. But the well is bottomless. The act continues without resolution. The scene becomes a reflection of human life, a ceaseless attempt to fill a space that is not designed to be filled. Through this image, another truth emerges. Dissatisfaction is not a personal failure. It is a structural condition of consciousness. The void is not a mistake. It is an opening, a space that reveals the limits of the will's capacity to define meaning. But instead of listening to this space, humans rush to silence it with new desires. They fear the stillness because stillness exposes the architecture of their longing. Yet in avoiding the void, they continue the cycle of dissatisfaction, mistaking motion for purpose. When all these strands converge, a single recognition sharpens. Human life operates on a rhythm of wanting that cannot be resolved by achieving. Satisfaction is a momentary pause in an ongoing process, not a destination. The self is built upon a structure that continuously generates lack, and the will transforms that lack into motion. To live without understanding this mechanism is to remain trapped in an endless pursuit that tires the soul while convincing the mind that fulfillment is close. And this leads to the next unavoidable question, one that pierces the continuity of human experience. If dissatisfaction is woven into the very structure of desire, then what does it reveal about the self that desires? What is this thing we call the self, this center of longing, this fragile point around which the cycle of wanting and emptiness revolves? Is it as solid as we believe, or is it another construction shaped by forces we barely understand? If dissatisfaction is woven into the very structure of desire, then what does it reveal about the self that desires? This question tears open the foundation we stand on. For the self is the most sacred illusion we carry and the most fragile. We cling to it as if it were solid, coherent, indivisible. Yet the moment we begin to examine it, its boundaries tremble. The self that longs is not a stable entity. but a shift in arrangement of perceptions, impulses, and interpretations. What we call I is not a fortress, but a mask. The first confrontation is unavoidable. The self appears unified, but its unity is manufactured. What we identify as I is a collection of experiences filtered through memory, emotion, and narrative. These fragments are stitched together into a story that pretends to be continuous, but the continuity is fiction. The self changes from moment to moment, shaped by forces it does not control. The belief in a fixed identity is not knowledge, but comfort, and the comfort is deceptive. Because the moment we believe in a solid I, we also begin defending it, fearing its dissolution, comparing it to others, and suffering from the weight of its imagined permanence. The second confrontation deepens the fracture. The boundaries of the self are not inherent. They are drawn by the mind, which distinguishes between me and not me with a precision feels natural, but is deeply artificial. This division creates the illusion of separateness, a sense of isolation that defines the human condition. The mind insists on this boundary because without it, individuality collapses. But the boundary also creates fear. It generates competition, envy, insecurity. It convinces us that our value depends on maintaining and protecting the fragile construct we call self. Yet the self is not a fortress. It is a ripple on the surface of a larger current. The third confrontation exposes the illusion further. The self is experienced as the author of thoughts, yet thoughts arise without our permission. They appear, unfold, and vanish according to patterns we do not choose. We do not decide our desires. We do not decide our fears. We do not decide the impulses that surge through us. These forces originate from layers far beneath conscious awareness, and the self arrives only afterward to narrate them. The sense of authorship is a retrospective illusion. The self claims ownership of events it did not create. And because it claims ownership, it also inherits the suffering that follows. The conclusion is sharp. The self is not the center of control. It is the center of interpretation. When this insight enters the landscape of the modern world in 2025, its implications become even more severe. Society amplifies the illusion of selfhood, encouraging individuals to polish their persona, curate their identity, optimize their image. What once was a simple sense of I has evolved into a performative project. People no longer just live, they maintain a brand. And this brand must be protected, displayed, validated. The pressure is relentless. The self becomes heavier, more brittle, more easily shattered. Modernity does not strengthen the self, it inflates it, until the smallest threat becomes unbearable. This inflation magnifies alienation. The more energy humans invest in constructing a desirable self, the further they drift from their actual experience. They begin living for the external reflection rather than the internal reality. They chase approval not because it fulfills them, but because it reassures the self that it still exists. When the reflection fades, the self trembles. When comparison arises, the self shrinks. When failure appears, the self collapses. The fragility of identity reveals itself beneath the performance, and the deeper truth emerges. The self that society encourages us to protect is precisely the one that causes the most suffering. Psychologically, the illusion becomes even more intricate. The self is built on the idea of separation, yet separation creates longing. We feel alone not because we are isolated, but because the self imagines itself as a fragment torn from the whole. This imagined fragmentation becomes the root of existential anxiety. The self senses its impermanence and fears it. It senses its constructed nature and denies it. It senses its vulnerability and overcompensates with pride, ambition, or defensiveness. The very mechanisms used to strengthen the self expose its weakness. And the more we cling to the illusion, the more pain it produces. To make this condition visible, imagine a wave rising from the ocean. The wave believes it is separate. It perceives itself as distinct, important, threatened. It fears dissolution. It competes with other waves for height and recognition. But the wave is not separate. Its form is temporary. Its boundaries exist only for a moment. What it calls I is nothing more than the shape water takes under certain conditions. When the conditions change, the form disappears, but the essence remains. The wave dissolves into the ocean it never left. The self is that wave, a temporary formation mistaken for an independent entity. From this image, the philosophical truth becomes unavoidable. The self is not an isolated being, but a phenomenon arising from conditions. It has no independent substance. It is a process, not a possession. And understanding this does not diminish life, it liberates it. When we realize the self is not solid, we stop defending it against imaginary threats. When we see that identity is fluid, we loosen our grip on perfection, comparison, and fear. When we understand that the I is not the ultimate reality, we cease to suffer from its fragility. The illusion loses its power. Yet this recognition is not easily embraced. Humans fear the dissolution of the self because they believe meaning depends on its continuity. But meaning is not found in the permanence of identity. Meaning emerges in the depth of experience, in the clarity that arises when the self is not clinging to its own image. Only when we loosen the boundaries of the I do we begin to see the world without distortion. And only then do we understand that suffering intensifies, not because life is harsh, but because the self refuses to let go of its illusions. When all these strands converge, a single truth crystallizes. Self, as ordinarily conceived, is a beautiful illusion, intricate and comforting, but ultimately false. It shapes our experience, but does not define our essence. It gives us coherence, but also confines us. It helps us navigate the world, but blinds us to our deeper nature. And once we recognize its illusory quality, a quiet question begins to rise, demanding our attention with the force of something long buried. If the self is not absolute, then why does loneliness feel so real? Why does the sense of separation persist even when we understand the illusion? What is this ache of isolation that follows us even when we know the boundaries of the self are drawn by the mind rather than by reality? If the boundaries of the self are drawn by the mind rather than by reality, then why does loneliness feel so real? This is the paradox that exposes the deepest layer of human experience. Loneliness persists not because we are truly separate, but because the illusion of the self generates emotional gravity strong enough to shape our entire inner world. The sense of being a solitary consciousness within a vast and indifferent universe is not a conclusion. It is an instinct, and instincts do not dissolve under philosophy. They reveal themselves even more sharply when questioned. The first confrontation opens here. Loneliness is not the absence of others. It is the presence of a divided self. Human beings feel alone even when surrounded, even when loved, even when recognized. The ache emerges not from external emptiness, but from internal fragmentation. The self, believing itself separate, constructs a private chamber inside the mind where no one else can enter. This chamber becomes the stage for all forms of isolation. And the tragic misunderstanding is this: people try to cure loneliness by adding company, yet the company does not reach the place where loneliness lives. The second confrontation pushes deeper. Loneliness intensifies as consciousness becomes more refined. The more a person becomes aware of their inner world, the more clearly they sense its unshared nature. Thought is solitary. Perception is solitary. Even emotion, though universal in structure, is experienced through the intimate filter of one's own history. No one can fully inhabit the inner landscape of another. This realization grows sharper with intelligence, sensitivity, and introspection. Far from being a sign of lack, loneliness becomes a sign of depth. Yet people misinterpret this depth as a personal failure. They assume their isolation reveals something lacking in them, when in truth, it reveals something intrinsic to being conscious at all. The third confrontation reveals the paradox at the heart of modern life. In the age of 2025, humans are more connected and more isolated than ever. Communication is constant, instantaneous, ubiquitous. Yet the very speed of connection creates a strange hollowness. Messages replace meaning. Engagement replaces intimacy. Proximity replaces presence. People speak endlessly but reveal little. They share fragments but not essence. They display themselves yet remain unseen. Loneliness grows not because we lack tools to connect, but because the tools encourage us to stay on the surface. Depth becomes rare, and without depth, understanding cannot be sustained. The psychological consequences of this fragmentation are profound. The self feels exposed yet unknown, visible yet unrecognizable. The more a person presents curated versions of themselves, the more distant they feel from their own center. Identity becomes an external project, and the inner world becomes neglected. This neglect is the true origin of modern loneliness. It is not that others cannot reach us. It is that we have stopped reaching inward. The self becomes a stranger to itself, and this estrangement magnifies the ache of isolation more than any external circumstance. Yet the roots go deeper still. Loneliness is not just an emotional state, it is an existential signal. It arises from the self's attempt to preserve its boundaries, even when those boundaries cause suffering. The self fears connection, because connection threatens its separateness. It fears dissolution. It fears vulnerability. It fears losing the fragile identity it has worked to protect. and so it oscillates between longing and withdrawal. The same mind that craves closeness resists it. The same heart that yearns for recognition hides behind defenses. Loneliness becomes the result of a self that cannot decide whether it wants to merge or to remain intact. To see this clearly, imagine a person standing behind a glass wall. The person sees others, hears them faintly, feels their presence. Yet the glass remains. It protects and imprisons. When others approach, the person steps back. When they leave, the person aches. The glass is not built by the world. It is built by the self. And the self does not know how to live without it. This image captures the essence of loneliness. It is not an external barrier, but an internal one. It reflects the mind's attempt to maintain control in a world where intimacy requires surrender. From this recognition emerges a deeper truth. Loneliness is not inherently negative. It is a mirror. It reveals the distance between who we think we are and what we truly are. It exposes the illusion of separation that the mind insists upon. And it reveals a longing not for people, but for wholeness. The ache does not come from the absence of others, but from the absence of unity within the self. When the self is fractured, the world feels distant. When the self is unified, even solitude feels connected. Modern culture often treats loneliness as a problem to be solved quickly. Yet quick solutions numb rather than illuminate. Distraction, entertainment, superficial relationships, constant noise, none of these address the root. They merely silence the symptom. And the symptom returns stronger because loneliness demands to be confronted, not avoided. It demands reflection on the nature of the self, not consumption of external stimulation. It demands stillness, the very thing the will cannot tolerate. And here lies the connection between loneliness and inner fragmentation. When the self is built on illusions, it cannot sustain depth. It becomes anxious, defensive, fragile. It depends on external validation to feel real. This dependence intensifies loneliness because external validation is always temporary. The moment it fades, the self collapses inward. Loneliness grows, not because others withdraw, but because the self lacks a stable foundation. Philosophically, loneliness exposes the core misunderstanding of human identity. The self imagines itself separate, yet it is part of a larger continuum. It imagines itself singular, yet it is composed of countless influences, memories, desires, and impulses that do not originate within it. Loneliness emerges when the self clings too tightly to its imagined boundaries. When it loosens that grip even slightly, the sense of isolation softens. Not because others enter, but because the boundary begins to dissolve. This does not mean the self disappears. It means the self becomes permeable, open, capable of resonance. Loneliness fades not when we find the perfect companion, but when we stop believing that our existence is confined to a narrow identity. Connection arises naturally when the self stops defending its edges. The world touches us. We touch the world. In that exchange, the illusion of separation weakens, revealing a subtle sense of belonging that was always present beneath the noise of desire and fear. To illustrate this shift, imagine the glass wall dissolving. The person no longer hides behind it. Others approach, and the person remains present. There is risk, but also possibility. There is vulnerability, but also depth. Loneliness begins to transform. It becomes not a wound, but an opening. Not a barrier, but a doorway. Through this doorway, the self encounters the world without losing itself. It feels connection without dependence. It experiences solitude without despair. And this transformation reveals one more insight. Loneliness is not the opposite of connection. Loneliness is the threshold of connection. It appears when the self begins to sense its own boundaries, and it disappears when those boundaries soften. It is both a warning and an invitation. It warns that the self has become too rigid, too defended, too isolated within its own narratives. And it invites us to see the illusory nature of that rigidity, to open, to let experience move freely through us rather than filtering it through fear. When all these threads converge, the recognition becomes clear. Loneliness is not a punishment. It is a teacher. It forces us to confront the illusion of separation, the fragility of identity, the depth of our longing for unity. It reveals that beneath our ache lies a truth we have resisted. We are not as separate as we believe. And once this truth begins to take root, another question emerges with quiet force, waiting to be confronted. If loneliness softens when the self loosens, then what happens in those rare moments when the self disappears entirely? What becomes possible when desire, fear, and identity fall silent long enough for beauty to enter? If the self disappears entirely, even for a moment, what becomes possible when desire, fear, and identity fall silent long enough for beauty to enter? This question is not poetic. It is surgical. It cuts directly into the structure of human consciousness. For there exists a state in which the will quiets, the self loosens, and the world reveals itself without the distortion of craving. This state is rare, fragile, temporary, yet it is powerful enough to expose what ordinary perception hides: the possibility of seeing life without wanting to possess it. The first confrontation begins with this truth: beauty is not an object, an attribute, or a property. Beauty is an interruption. It suspends the will. It freezes the machinery of desire long enough for consciousness to perceive without grasping. When a person is struck by music, or confronted by a painting, or overwhelmed by the light on a quiet street, something essential happens inside them. The inner voice that demands, judges, compares, falls silent. The restless self pauses. And in that pause, the world appears not as something to acquire, but as something to witness. The misunderstanding is persistent. People assume they enjoy beauty because it pleases them. But beauty does not please, it arrests. And the arrest is the first taste of freedom. The second confrontation reveals why this interruption carries such weight. When the will pauses, even for a breath, the self ceases to dictate meaning. Without desire, experience becomes pure. Without intention, perception becomes clear. This clarity is not intellectual, it is existential. It gives the mind access to a mode of being where suffering temporarily loses its foundation. Because suffering depends on the will's endless demands. In the presence of beauty, these demands dissolve. The world is enough. The self is quiet. And peace appears not as a goal, but as a natural state that was always waiting beneath the noise. Yet humans misinterpret these moments. They believe the beauty comes from the object. They chase sunsets, concert halls, rare experiences, hoping the same feeling will return. But the power was never in the object. It was in the suspension of the self. The object merely triggered a temporary collapse of the will's structure. The real transformation happened inside. And because people misunderstand this, they search endlessly for the external instead of recognizing the internal shift that made the moment possible. The third confrontation exposes the deeper mystery. Why does beauty silence the will when nothing else can? Pleasure excites the will. Desire intensifies it. Achievement feeds it. But beauty interrupts it. The reason is simple and severe. Beauty reveals a world that does not need us. A world that stands on its own, independent of our desires. It confronts the self with something it cannot manipulate, consume, or control. And in that confrontation, the self retreats. It recognizes its limits. For a brief moment, the self stops pretending to be the center of existence. It becomes transparent. Through that transparency, the world shines. In the world of 2025, this suspension becomes even more rare and more precious. Modern life accelerates the will to a relentless pace. Distraction multiplies. Attention fragments. Desire becomes constant background noise. Noise so loud that silence feels almost unnatural. People scroll through images of beauty without ever entering the state beauty requires. They consume representations rather than encounter presence. They accumulate aesthetic experiences without experiencing the aesthetic. And so, the moments that could liberate them remain out of reach, buried beneath speed. Yet, when beauty does break through, even in this accelerated world, it remains untouched by the pace around it. A person may be rushing through a crowded street when suddenly a child's laughter, the curve of a shadow, or a piece of music leaking from an open window stops them. Time feels different. Space feels different. The self feels different. Beauty reclaims its ancient role, not entertainment, but revelation. It reveals that beneath the frantic motion of desire lies a stillness the mind has forgotten. It reveals that consciousness can exist without craving. It reveals that the world is not merely an arena for ambition, but a source of quiet astonishment. Psychologically, this quiet astonishment serves a vital function. It allows the mind to breathe. When the will pauses, the nervous system relaxes. The internal tension releases. The constant contraction of striving softens. Beauty becomes an antidote, not because it solves suffering, but because it momentarily removes the structure that generates suffering. It gives the mind a glimpse of life without the burden of becoming. And once the mind has tasted this mode of being, even briefly, it cannot entirely forget it. The memory becomes a reference point. The person begins to sense that freedom is not in acquiring more, but in wanting less. To illuminate this state, imagine a person standing before a work of art. At first, they look with intention. They analyze. They interpret. They seek meaning. Then something shifts. The boundaries of the self loosen. The world inside aligns with the world outside. The person is no longer looking at the art. They are inside the experience of looking. The artwork does not communicate information. It reveals presence. And in this presence, the person forgets themselves. The forgetting is not a loss, but a release. It is the relief of no longer carrying the weight of identity. From this image emerges a deeper truth. Beauty does not liberate us by adding anything to life. It liberates by subtracting. It removes craving. It removes fear. It removes the endless commentary that fills consciousness. What remains is immediate, unfiltered, open. People often describe beauty as transcendence, but transcendence is not rising above life. It is sinking fully into it, without resistance, without agenda, without the self demanding confirmation of its own importance. This capacity for surrender is why beauty can feel like a form of truth. Not factual truth, experiential truth. A truth that reveals what the world looks like when the self stops interfering with it. In those moments, we see not through the lens of desire, but through the lens of being. And being is enough. The simplicity shocks us because we are accustomed to complication. The clarity unsettles us because we are accustomed to distortion. But the shock is a reminder. The unsettling is an awakening. Beauty shows us what consciousness is capable of when it is not enslaved to the will. Yet these moments fade. They always fade. The will returns. The self rebuilds. Identity reasserts itself. The machinery of desire begins turning again. And humans often mourn the loss, believing they have fallen from a higher state. But this mourning is misguided. The fading is part of the structure. Beauty cannot be constant, because constancy would turn it into habit, and habit cannot liberate. Beauty is powerful because it interrupts. It appears unexpectedly. It cuts through the familiar. It destabilizes the will precisely because it is fleeting. Its impermanence is its force. And yet, even after beauty fades, something remains, a residue, a memory not of the object, but of the selfless clarity it produced. Humans do not long for beauty itself. They long for the state in which the self was quiet. They long for the moment when they were free from themselves. This longing is often misunderstood as nostalgia, but it is something deeper. It is a signal that the mind has glimpsed its own potential for liberation. And once glimpsed, the possibility cannot be entirely denied. When all these threads converge, the recognition becomes sharp. Beauty is not decoration, it is doorway. It is proof that the will is not absolute, that the self is not permanent, that consciousness can touch reality without distortion. In moments of aesthetic stillness, we encounter not escape but truth, not illusion but clarity. And once we understand this, another truth rises like a quiet but undeniable force. If beauty suspends the will and reveals the permeability of the self, then what happens when this permeability extends beyond the aesthetic moment? What opens within us when compassion emerges, not as moral virtue, but as the recognition that the boundary between self and other was never solid to begin with? If beauty suspends the will and reveals the permeability of the self, then what happens when this permeability extends beyond the aesthetic moment? What opens within us when compassion emerges? Not as moral virtue, but as the recognition that the boundary between self and other was never solid to begin with. This question confronts the very architecture of human consciousness. For compassion is not sentiment, not kindness, not goodness. Compassion is perception. It arises when the illusion of separateness falters, when the self begins to sense that its edges are not walls, but membranes. The first confrontation begins here. Compassion is not a choice. It is an insight. When we see another person suffering and feel it echo within us, this echo is not imitation. It is recognition. Something in us understands that the pain of another is not alien. It belongs to the same field of experience from which we arise. This recognition refuses the lie of isolation. It exposes the truth that the same forces shaping our anguish shape the anguish of others. We do not feel for them, we feel with them. The distinction matters. Feeling for is distance. Feeling with is dissolution. The second confrontation deepens the realization. Compassion appears when the self softens, when the rigid identity that defends itself begins to loosen its boundaries. The will, which normally drives us towards self-preservation, steps aside briefly. In that pause, we sense the continuity between beings. The idea of self and other becomes less defined, less sharp, less absolute. And in that blurred space, empathy becomes possible. Not the emotional reaction taught by culture, but the existential recognition that all beings move under the same burdens: fear, longing, uncertainty, impermanence. Modern society often mistakes compassion for strategy. But compassion is not performed. It arises naturally when one sees clearly. Misunderstanding arises because people conflate compassion with pity. Pity assumes hierarchy. Compassion assumes unity. Pity creates distance. Compassion erases it. When a person pities another, reinforces the separation that keeps them safe. But when genuine compassion arises, the separation collapses. The suffering of the other becomes our own, not because of moral obligation, but because of metaphysical insight. The self senses that it is not an isolated fragment, but a temporary expression of something larger, something shared. The third confrontation exposes the existential power of compassion. When we recognize the shared fabric of experience, something unexpected happens. The anxiety of the self diminishes. Suffering becomes less personal. Pain becomes less isolating. The self stops interpreting every difficulty as a private failure and begins seeing struggle as a condition of being alive. Compassion frees us not only from cruelty, but from self-absorption. And in freeing us from self-absorption, it reduces the suffering produced by the constant defense of identity. Compassion is therefore not a weakness. It is a form of clarity that pierces through the self's illusions. In the modern world of 2025, compassion becomes both more necessary and more difficult. Technology connects people globally, yet the psychological distance between them grows. Each person becomes a curated persona, a digital construct easier to judge than to understand. The more mediated human interaction becomes, the harder it is to sense the shared interior behind the surfaces. The self, already fragile, becomes performative. The other becomes abstract. And compassion struggles to survive in abstraction. Compassion requires presence. It requires seeing the other not as symbol, not as avatar, not as role, but as a being whose inner world resembles our own in complexity and vulnerability. Yet compassion does appear, even in this fractured landscape. And when it does, it carries extraordinary force. It interrupts the machinery of competition. It weakens the narratives of isolation. It disrupts the cultural expectation that individuals must always protect themselves at the expense of others. Compassion reveals that the self who protects itself so fiercely is the same self that suffers because of its isolation. The paradox resolves only in connection. Psychologically, compassion exposes a truth the self tries to hide. The more we care for others, the less we are dominated by our own fear. Fear isolates, compassion connects. Fear contracts, compassion expands. Fear narrows consciousness to survival. Compassion widens consciousness to include the experience of another. This widening brings relief because it dissolves the claustrophobia of living solely inside one's own mind. The self that expands suffers differently. It does not suffer less, but its suffering loses the sharpness created by isolation. It becomes softer, more spacious, less suffocating. To clarify this shift, imagine two individuals sitting across from each other, each carrying their private burdens. At first, they appear separate, like closed rooms with thick walls. But gradually, as one reveals a truth, a fear, a wound, the other feels something resonate. The walls thin, the distance softens. For a moment, the illusion of separateness weakens. The rooms are no longer sealed. Each becomes a doorway into the other's experience. Compassion opens those doorways, not through effort, but through recognition. It shows that beneath the differences of circumstance lies the same trembling core of existence. This image reveals something essential. Compassion is not about solving the suffering of others. It is about recognizing it as our own. This recognition does not increase suffering, it transforms it. When suffering is shared, it becomes bearable. When suffering is shared, it becomes meaningful. When suffering is shared, it becomes less like punishment and more like testimony, evidence of the common human struggle to remain intact under the weight of impermanence. Compassion also reveals another truth. The self is not diminished by extending beyond its boundaries. It becomes more real. The illusion of isolation makes the self fragile. But when the self recognizes its continuity with others, it becomes resilient. It gains depth. It gains perspective. It gains the ability to witness its own pain without drowning in it. Compassion is the bridge that allows the self to remain itself without being confined to itself. And through this widening, compassion touches something even deeper, the possibility of ethical life that arises not from rules, but from insight. Ethics grounded in obligation becomes mechanical. Ethics grounded in compassion becomes natural. When we see ourselves in the suffering of others, harmful action becomes difficult. When the boundary between self and other dissolves, the motivations behind cruelty collapse. Moral behavior becomes not enforced, but inevitable. Compassion becomes the root of genuine responsibility. Yet the most profound consequence of compassion is internal, not external. When compassion arises, the self becomes transparent to itself. It realizes that its suffering is neither unique nor isolated. It realizes that its longing for connection is not weakness, but instinct. And it realizes that its capacity for empathy is not learned, but remembered. Compassion is the memory of unity buried beneath the illusion of separation. But this recognition raises a new question. If the self widens through compassion, how far can it widen? What happens when the self extends not only toward other humans, but toward all living beings, toward nature, toward existence itself? What becomes of the self when the boundary dissolves so fully that life is no longer experienced as a private struggle, but as a shared movement of a single underlying reality? And this question leads with quiet inevitability to another confrontation, one that pierces the heart of human striving. If compassion softens the will, then what becomes possible when we examine the will itself? Not to obey it, not to fight it, but to transcend its cycle. What opens in us when we finally understand the nature of desire deeply enough to stop being driven by it? If compassion softens the will, then what becomes possible when we examine the will itself? Not to obey it, not to fight it, but to transcend its cycle. This question forces us into the deepest chamber of human existence. For the will is not merely a force that pushes us toward desire. It is the architect of our suffering, the silent engine behind restlessness, the unseen puppeteer of our ambitions and fears. And yet, most people live without ever questioning the authority of this inner tyrant. They call its commands natural. They call its cravings identity. They call its demands their own. The first confrontation begins with the recognition that desire is not a problem to be solved, but a mechanism to be understood. The will operates by generating a sense of lack. Without lack, it cannot move. Without movement, it cannot sustain itself. So it creates hunger, then offers objects to fill the hunger, then ensures that the objects never satisfy the hunger for long. This cycle is not accidental, it is structural. When people attempt to eliminate desire through suppression or discipline, they fail because they target the symptoms, not the engine. Desire regenerates because the will regenerates. To transcend the cycle, one must understand the will as a process, not a master. The second confrontation exposes the subtlety of this process. The will disguises itself inside motives that appear noble, rational, or spiritual. A person believes they seek success for meaning. They believe they pursue relationships for love. They believe they strive for improvement out of aspiration. Yet underneath these narratives lies a simpler truth. The will pushes, and the mind interprets. The push comes first. The story comes second. This is why desire feels both personal and impersonal, intimate and foreign. It arises within us, yet it does not feel chosen. It erupts like weather inside the psyche, demanding movement, regardless of our understanding. The misunderstanding is universal. People assume that freedom means choosing between desires. But choosing between desires is not freedom. It is rearranging the furniture inside the same prison. The will remains the warden. The self remains the captive. Freedom requires stepping outside the cycle, not reorganizing it. And stepping outside begins with the realization that desire is neither the enemy nor the truth. It is simply the momentum of existence passing through us. The third confrontation opens the path toward transcendence. To transcend desire does not mean eliminating it, but ceasing to identify with it. Desire loses its absolute power when we stop mistaking it for our essence. When a craving arises, it is seen as an event, not a command. When fear appears, it is observed, not obeyed. When longing stirs, it is felt, not fused with identity. This shift is subtle, yet radical. The will continues to operate, but its force becomes transparent. It no longer determines the meaning of life. It no longer shapes the self from the inside out. It becomes one voice among many, not the sovereign of consciousness. In the world of 2025, this transcendence becomes both more challenging and more essential. Modern society inflames desire constantly. Every image, every device, every platform is engineered to accelerate craving. The will is no longer a natural impulse. It is industrialized, manufactured, monetized. The world feeds the will with precision, ensuring that people remain restless, unsatisfied, endlessly consuming. This environment makes transcendence rare because stillness becomes unnatural. Silence becomes frightening. Reflection becomes uncomfortable. The mind, conditioned by constant stimulation, loses the capacity to witness desire without acting on it. Yet precisely because the world accelerates craving, the possibility of awakening becomes sharper. The contrast between compulsion and clarity widens. Individuals begin to sense that their desires are not their own. They feel manipulated by impulses they never asked for. They sense that their striving does not lead to meaning, but to exhaustion. This exhaustion, though painful, becomes the doorway to insight. When the will pushes too hard, consciousness begins to rebel. It begins to ask questions it once avoided. It begins to suspect that freedom lies not in satisfying desire, but in understanding it. Psychologically, the turning point occurs when a person experiences desire without moving toward it, not suppressing it, not indulging it, simply seeing it. In this seeing, the will loses its invisibility. It becomes an object of attention rather than the controller of attention. And the moment it becomes an object, its authority weakens. The self, no longer fused with the will's impulses, gains space. Space for awareness, space for choice, space for being rather than becoming. This space is the beginning of liberation. To illustrate this shift, imagine a person standing on the shore, watching waves crash against the sand. The waves are strong, rhythmic, relentless, just like desire. The ordinary reaction is to enter the water, to be carried by the current, to move wherever the waves push. But now, imagine the person simply watching, not resisting, not entering, not drowning, just observing the movement without being moved. The waves do not disappear, they continue, but their power changes. They become phenomena, not commands. This is the essence of transcending desire, not silencing the waves, but stepping out of the water. From this image emerges a deeper insight. The will loses its power not through force, but through understanding. When we understand the will, we stop believing its promises. We stop assuming that the next achievement will complete us. We stop imagining that desire points toward fulfillment. We begin to see the cycle for what it is: repetition disguised as progress. This recognition does not make life empty. It makes life clear. It frees us to act without illusion. Transcending desire does not kill ambition. It purifies it. Actions become expressions of clarity rather than desperation. Relationships become choices rather than dependencies. Work becomes participation rather than self-definition. The self stops searching for completion through external means because it no longer imagines itself incomplete. And when the self no longer imagines itself incomplete, the will loses its leverage. Yet, transcendence is fragile. The will does not vanish permanently. It waits. It returns. It tests the boundaries of our awareness. The cycle tries to reclaim us. But each time we observe desire without fusing with it, the cycle weakens. Each moment of clarity expands the space of being. And over time, the mind learns to move without craving, to act without compulsion, to exist without the constant ache of needing something more. As all these threads converge, a final truth emerges. Transcending desire is not an escape from life, but an entrance into it. When desire no longer dictates the meaning of experience, life becomes wider, softer, more spacious. We participate in existence rather than chase it. We inhabit moments rather than hunt for the next one. We realize that freedom is not controlling desire, but not being controlled by it. And in this realization, a new question rises. with the weight of something long awaited. If the will can be transcended through awareness, then what becomes of the intense forces that shape our most intimate relationships? What happens to love, to longing, to the powerful currents of sexuality and instinct when we finally see them not as destiny, but as part of the same machinery that has always governed desire? If the forces behind love, longing, sexuality, and instinct belong to the same machinery that has always governed desire, then the question becomes inevitable. What is love when stripped of its idealization, its mythology, its illusions? This question is not romantic. It is merciless. For love, more than any other human experience, exposes the tension between what the will demands and what consciousness hopes for. It promises transcendence, yet often delivers suffering. It appears as liberation, yet binds us more tightly than any other desire. And when examined with clarity, it reveals itself as both a profound connection and a calculated strategy of life itself. The first confrontation is unavoidable. Love feels personal, intimate, unique, but its structure is impersonal. Long before consciousness attaches meaning to it, instinct pushes us towards certain bodies, certain voices, certain presences. Attraction arises from depths we do not control. The will selects what the mind later justifies. We believe we choose whom we love, but love chooses us. It erupts from biological programming, evolutionary patterns, unconscious memories, unexamined wounds. The self arrives late, claiming ownership of a process it did not initiate. This misinterpretation creates the first illusion, that love originates in freedom. But love originates in necessity. The second confrontation exposes the cycle of longing. Desire intensifies when love seems unattainable, uncertain, incomplete. The ache of wanting becomes the fuel that carries the entire emotional experience. People confuse this ache for depth. They mistake turmoil for passion. But longing is not proof of love. Longing is proof of the will's investment. When the beloved is distant, the will intensifies its grip. The imagined completion becomes the object of devotion. Once attained, the intensity shifts. The will adapts. The high fades. The object becomes familiar. Desire seeks new fuel, new uncertainty, new threat, new distance. The cycle repeats not because love fails, but because the will cannot sustain fulfillment. Fulfillment is death to the will. This misunderstanding damages modern hearts. People believe love fades because the partner changes, because passion weakens, because time erodes beauty. But the fading is structural. The will cannot remain satisfied. And so, humans idealize the early stage of love, the intoxicating moment where longing and possibility intertwine, mistaking chemical intensity for emotional truth. They chase this stage repeatedly, abandoning relationships when reality appears. Yet, they are not chasing love. They are chasing the will's temporary illusion of transcendence. The third confrontation destabilizes the deepest illusion. Love appears selfless, but much of what is called love is disguised self-preservation. The self attaches to the beloved because it senses in them a source of validation, meaning, protection, reflection. The beloved becomes a mirror that confirms the self exists, matters, is chosen. When this mirror shifts, the self panics. Jealousy arises. Control appears. Fear replaces tenderness. The will, sensing potential loss, tightens its grip. What was once affection becomes strategy. Humans mistake dependency for devotion, but dependency is not love. Dependency is the will defending its investment. In the world of 2025, this confusion becomes even more profound. Technology accelerates desire, multiplies romantic possibilities, amplifies comparison, heightens insecurity. People curate versions of themselves for attraction, transforming love into performance. The beloved becomes a projection screen for fantasies rather than a real, finite, complex human being. Romance becomes gamified. Intimacy becomes optional. Attachment becomes unstable. And yet the longing remains. This longing pushes individuals into relationships that are more fragile, more idealized, more disposable. The will thrives in this landscape. The self suffers. Psychologically, love reveals cracks in identity that no other experience exposes. The self wants to merge with the beloved, yet fears losing itself. It seeks closeness, yet resists. Vulnerability. It wants truth, yet hides behind defenses. Love amplifies contradiction. Humans imagine love will complete them, but love illuminates their incompleteness. They imagine love will heal them, but love exposes their wounds. They imagine love will give them certainty, but love multiplies uncertainty. These contradictions are not mistakes. They are the architecture of emotional existence. To understand this clearly, imagine two individuals drawn toward each other by forces neither can explain. They feel connection, intensity, recognition. Yet beneath this recognition lies a deeper phenomenon. Each sees in the other a reflection of their inner longing, not a reflection of their true self, but a projection of what they hope will soothe their inner ache. As they draw closer, the projections begin to fade, replaced by the reality of another consciousness with its own fears, desires, contradictions. This moment marks the turning point. If they can love the real person, not the projection, love deepens. If they cannot, the will withdraws, seeking a new projection to animate. This reveals a deeper truth. Real love begins where illusion ends. But illusions are seductive, and the will depends on them to generate intensity. Thus, most relationships oscillate between projection and disappointment. People fall in love with their own imagination, not with the human being in front of them. And when imagination collapses, they assume love is lost. But love was never present, only idealization was. Sexuality exposes the will even more clearly. Desire's physical form reveals how deeply instinct governs attraction. The erotic impulse emerges from layers far beneath reasoning. It pushes toward replication, continuation, intensity. It binds pleasure and vulnerability into a single experience. Humans often mistake sexual passion for emotional truth, assuming the body reveals what the heart hides. But the body reveals the will. It does not reveal meaning. sexual. Attraction is powerful because it bypasses the self entirely. It forces surrender. It dissolves boundaries. It exposes the fragility of control. This is why sexuality is both ecstatic and terrifying. Yet sexuality is not the enemy of love. It is simply not evidence of it. Love can exist without sexual intensity. Sexuality can exist without love. When they align, the experience deepens not because biology supports unity, but because consciousness interprets the alignment as meaningful. The meaning is constructed, but the construction can be beautiful if recognized as such. A deeper layer emerges when we consider instinct. Instinct does not ask whether love will bring happiness. Instinct does not search for compatibility or emotional maturity. Instinct searches for continuity. Traits, signals, patterns buried in evolution influence our choices. Entire relationships form around impulses that consciousness understands only afterward. And because instinct does not aim at individual happiness, relationships shaped primarily by instinct often produce conflict. The will selects partners that serve biological strategies, not psychological well-being. Consciousness arrives later to manage the consequences. This recognition is not cynical, it is clarifying. Love becomes more authentic when understood honestly. When we stop expecting love to fulfill impossible promises, we begin to appreciate its real power. Love cannot save us from suffering. Love cannot complete the self. Love cannot eliminate desire. But love can soften the boundaries of the self. It can open us to vulnerability. It can reveal dimensions of our being inaccessible through isolation. Love becomes meaningful not because it ends suffering, but because it reveals the shared nature of suffering. And this revelation prepares the mind for a deeper question. If the will shapes love and the self misinterprets it, then what happens when love inevitably encounters its opposite? Not hatred, but loss. Not rejection, but impermanence. What becomes of the self when the thing it clings to dissolves? What becomes of love when life confronts it with the most unavoidable truth of all? If love inevitably encounters impermanence, then what becomes of the self when the thing it clings to dissolves? What happens when loss arrives not as a possibility, but as a certainty? This question forces consciousness into a confrontation it spends its entire life avoiding, for nothing exposes the illusion of identity more brutally than the presence of death. Not only the death of others, but the death of the self we defend so fiercely. And when we face this truth without distraction, something essential is revealed. What we fear is not death, but the collapse of the story we call I. The first confrontation begins with the recognition that death is not a distant event. Death is woven into every moment of life. Cells die, thoughts die, desires die. Selves rise and fall within us like shifting constellations. Yet humans deny this impermanence because they cling to the fantasy of continuity. The mind constructs a narrative that pretends the self moving through time is the same self that began the story. But death exposes the lie. The story ends. The narrator disappears. The continuity collapses. What remains is the silence that was always beneath our words. Modern culture, especially in the world of 2025, sanitizes death, hiding it behind rituals, screens, medical language. People speak of passing, transition, closure, as if softening the vocabulary softens the reality. But the mind recognizes the truth beneath these euphemisms. It recognizes that everything it clings to is temporary. And this recognition terrifies the self because it reveals the fragility of its existence. The fear is not of non-existence. The fear is of losing control. The fear is of surrendering to a force that does not negotiate. The second confrontation emerges from this fear. Death threatens the self because the self depends on boundaries, on continuity, on the belief that it is real. But death reveals that the self is a temporary formation, like a pattern on water. When the pattern dissolves, the water remains. The self does not disappear into nothingness. It disappears into the same reality it arose from. The dissolution feels catastrophic only because the self confuses its own impermanence with the impermanence of being itself. But being does not vanish, only the form does. Humans misunderstand this dissolution because they mistake the self for essence. They assume identity must persist beyond death for life to have meaning. They assume consciousness must continue for existence to remain valuable. But this assumption arises from fear, not insight. Meaning does not depend on permanence. Meaning depends on presence. And presence is possible only because things end. If life were endless, it would lose all urgency, all significance, all depth. Mortality is not an obstacle to meaning. Mortality generates meaning. The third confrontation forces us deeper into the psychological dimension of death. What humans fear most is not the moment of dying, but the loss of the known. The self fears the collapse of familiar sensations, memories, relationships, desires. It fears the disappearance of its narrative identity. It fears the unknown. But the unknown is the natural state of existence. Every moment arises from the unknown. Every thought emerges from silence. Every experience comes from a place beyond comprehension. Death is simply the most visible expression of this mystery. It is the final reminder that the self never controlled anything. To understand this clearly, imagine a flame burning in a room. The flame flickers, shifts, changes shape, grows, shrinks. We call it a flame, but what we name is only a momentary configuration of heat and light. When the flame goes out, we say it has died. But nothing essential disappears. The heat disperses. The energy returns to the environment. The flame was never a thing. It was a phenomenon. The self is that flame. Its disappearance feels tragic only when we mistake the phenomenon for the essence. The truth is less dramatic. The phenomenon ends. Reality remains. This recognition does not diminish the emotional weight of death. It clarifies it. Grief arises precisely because love revealed our permeability. Loss reveals it again. When someone we love disappears, the boundary between self and other collapses in pain rather than joy. We feel part of ourselves torn away, not because the other was part of our identity, but because identity itself is porous. Grief is not the wound of separation. Grief is the proof that separation was always an illusion. We grieve because connection was real. In the modern world, grief is resisted as if it were a malfunction. People rush to recovery, to closure, to productivity, believing that returning to normal is a measure of strength. But grief does not demand resolution. It demands acknowledgement. It demands that we allow ourselves to feel the dissolving of an attachment, the shifting of identity, the collapse of a story that once felt permanent. Grief is a mirror in which the self sees its own vulnerability without disguise. It is painful precisely because it is honest. Death also reveals a paradox. The self fears its own disappearance, yet much of its suffering comes from the illusion of its permanence. The belief that the self must survive creates anxiety, defensiveness, attachment, isolation. Death dissolves this belief, not as philosophy, but as reality. And in that dissolution, a deeper freedom becomes possible. Not the freedom of endless existence, but the freedom from clinging to existence as if it were ours to control. Psychologically, the fear of death is the fear of losing identity. But identity itself is a temporary construction. When we recognize this, the fear loosens, not as comfort, but as truth. The self does not need to survive death to be meaningful. The self needs to recognize that its value does not depend on permanence. Meaning arises in the quality of experience, not its duration. Identity becomes lighter when we stop demanding that it lasts forever. To illuminate this shift, imagine standing at the edge of a vast horizon. The sun has just disappeared. The sky holds the last traces of light. The world is silent. In this moment, nothing is lost. Nothing is gained. There is no self to defend, no story to maintain, no desire to fulfill. What remains is presence. The horizon does not promise tomorrow. It does not mourn yesterday. It simply exists. And in witnessing it, something inside us remembers that we too are not the story we tell, but the awareness that perceives it. From this image emerges a crucial truth. Death is not the opposite of life. Death is the opposite of birth. Life contains both. Life is the movement between them. When we stop resisting death, we stop resisting life. When we accept impermanence, experience existence with greater intensity, greater openness, greater honesty, death becomes not an intrusion, but a teacher. It reveals what matters by erasing what does not. All the illusions of the self crumble in the presence of mortality. Control dissolves. Desire shrinks. Pretense becomes meaningless. What remains is the raw clarity of being. And this clarity prepares the mind for an even deeper question. If the self is temporary, if desire is cyclical, if love is fragile, if loss is inevitable, then what remains when all illusions have fallen away? What form of freedom becomes possible when the self releases its final defense and stands unguarded before reality? The journey through these ideas leads to a single revelation. Nothing in the human condition is accidental. Our longing, our confusion, our fear, our sudden moments of clarity, all emerge from the same hidden architecture that shapes every breath of our existence. We suffer not because life is cruel, but because we mistake the transient for the permanent and the constructed for the real. We cling to desires that can never complete us, identities that can never contain us, illusions that can never save us. And yet, within this fragile structure lies a quiet possibility, the freedom to see clearly. When we confront the will, we loosen its grip. When we recognize the illusion of the self, we stop defending what was never solid. When we face loneliness, we uncover our longing for unity. When beauty silences us, we glimpse a world that does not need our control. When compassion widens us, we feel the pulse of something larger than our private story. When we witness love without illusion, we understand the depth of our vulnerability. And when we look directly at death, we discover that meaning does not come from permanence, but from presence. To live lightly in a heavy world is not to escape reality, but to stop fighting it. It is to see that anxiety is woven into being conscious, that desire moves through us, but does not define us, that the self is temporary, but awareness is vast, that art, tenderness, and compassion open doors the will cannot close, and that clarity, once seen, cannot be forgotten. Philosophy does not remove our burdens. It removes our blindness to them. And in that new vision, something fierce and quiet arises. The ability to stand inside this impermanent world without collapsing under its weight. The ability to walk through uncertainty without demanding guarantees. The ability to feel deeply without clinging desperately. In the end, the task is simple and severe. To understand ourselves enough to stop being driven by forces we never chose. To let life be what it is, rather than what we fear it might be. To enter existence with eyes open, willing to meet both its ache and its beauty without turning away. And perhaps the greatest truth is this: freedom does not begin when the world changes. Freedom begins when we finally see the world as it is, and ourselves as we are, without illusion. Only then can we step into life, not as its prisoner, but as its witness.